Let's go ahead and get started. My name is Yasin Zohar. I work with Climate Interactive. Today we're going to be talking about our world climate simulation, which is a role-playing exercise that we've developed alongside some of our partners at MIT and the University of Massachusetts Lowell. So this webinar is intended for those who are maybe interested in learning a little bit more about the simulation, as well as potentially becoming facilitators of this game. So the World Climate Simulation has been run all around the world. It's been going for many years now, and it's facilitators like you all who really help us get this running in so many different places. And so we're excited to have you all here in hopes to kind of adding some of your own pins and locations on the map. Also, for any of you who are potentially thinking about running this in a language other than English, we have a lot of our materials and our models available in different languages. So at the end, I'll be showing you around our website a little bit and letting you know how you might be able to run this in a language other than English to really make sure that your participants get the best understanding that they can of the simulation and of the game. So how the World Climate Simulation works is it's basically based off of the annual UN climate negotiations that happen every year. The next ones are happening in a few weeks' time. So it's a way to really allow students or community members or those who work in different organizations or companies to get a bit of a better sense of what's being negotiated and what really happens in some of the different power dynamics at these negotiations and these talks. A lot of us are not able to attend the talks, and they kind of maybe seem a little bit distant or something separate from many of us. So we hope that the World Climate Simulation kind of brings some of that a little bit closer and allows people to share some of the different understandings of what happens at these negotiations. And so a lot of it is based on the 2015 gathering, which was in Paris, and where the Paris Agreement was agreed on. And one of the main goals of that is limiting warming to well below 2 degrees and aiming for 1.5 degrees. So with that target in mind, that's really how we play most of world climate, with the 2 degree or 1.5 degree target in mind. By 2100 is how we tend to play it. So a typical agenda is as follows. Usually the game lasts about 2 to 3.5 hours. Sometimes if you have less than 2 hours, we have some tips on how you might run it in a condensed way. You can shorten some of these. You can have less rounds of negotiations. We've also seen it a lot longer than 3.5 hours if you are planning to run it in a classroom setting. Sometimes we see people or facilitators who will split up the game into maybe 2 different sessions, 2 different classes. You'll notice that the debrief is quite long, and we like to dedicate quite a lot of time to it. So sometimes people will have the debrief in a next session, but most typically we have it all in one session in about 2 to 3.5 hours. We're going to break down each of these sections individually, but essentially you'll introduce yourself and the game, and introduce the idea that participants are split up into groups, and you'll have different ways in which you can split them up, which we'll go over. And once you've kind of introduced it quite casually, you'll then start everybody and yourself into taking the official roles that they've been assigned, and you'll open the conference more officially in that way. And then the participants in the different groups will submit proposals and negotiate with each other for a certain number of rounds, depending on your time. And then you'll conclude the meeting, and everybody will step out of their roles, and then you'll have a debrief with everybody. So we're going to break those down a little bit. So the way that we break down the groups in the World Climate Simulation is we have two main options. We have the 3-region version and we have the 6-region version. So the main factor in deciding which version to play is based on your number of participants. We find that the 3-region version is best for small groups of maybe 10 people or less, or really big groups, maybe of over 50 or 100 people. So that's really how we suggest people choose the different versions. The 6-region is more kind of any size in the middle there. So in the 3-region version, we break it up into developed, developing A, and developing B. Developing A is what we are most commonly familiar with, rapidly emerging economies like China and India, and developing B is all other countries that don't fall into the developed country or the rapidly emerging economies group. And then the 6-region version just kind of pulls out some of those countries specifically. So you have the United States as its own group, the European Union, and then other developed countries all in one. And then you'll have China and India as their own individual groups. And then you'll have other developing, which is just everybody else. So you'll notice there are some of these little icons next to some of these groups. Essentially, why we do that is to show some of the power dynamics that might exist pretty visibly. So we suggest that you as a facilitator, whoever is helping you organize, set up the tables and the groups in a pretty intentional way. So, for example, here, the United States group might have a lot of food, some comfortable chairs, the European Union as well. China might have less of that, but still access to some of those things. And then with the other developing group, and in the 3-region version, the developing B, you'll see that there's this kind of image where we actually encourage people to sit on the floor. So if that's accessible for you all and for your group, it starts a pretty interesting conversation and curiosity pretty early on in the simulation. So people might be asking why they're sitting on the floor and why other people are not, and it gets some of the conversation going a little bit about the different power dynamics that might exist during these negotiations. So here are just some photos of how some of our facilitators have run the World Climate Simulation in their rooms. You'll notice in each of these there's a group sitting on the floor. Some of the tables have more food, more tablecloths, are a little more comfortable. For the most part, everybody has kind of been set up in a way that they can look at the front of the room, where we encourage, if you're able to, some kind of projector or a way that you can show some slides and some models that are quite integral to the World Climate Simulation. So you'll notice that everybody can look at the front of the room, and you as a facilitator will be standing up there presenting and taking on your role. So once each of the groups are kind of set up and sitting where they should be, they'll receive these confidential briefings, which are briefing statements to give them a sense of their country or their negotiating bloc's priorities and interests in these negotiations. So these are useful for people to kind of get on the same page about everything. And they're also really useful if people haven't necessarily had much of a background in climate or climate negotiations, these briefings are really all that they'll need. So if you're wondering if your participants have enough knowledge on climate, or if you're wondering if you can run this for people who don't necessarily have too much of a background in this, we always encourage it, and these briefing statements really help everybody just kind of get on the same page and not need to do any previous research. So each group will get these briefing statements for their block or country, and they'll also get this proposal form. So this is what they'll be submitting after every round, and what they'll be negotiating over, and what they'll propose. So the first big section is about emissions. So as a group, they'll decide when they would like their greenhouse gas emissions to peak. And if they so choose to have their emissions reduce as well, they'll also decide in what year those might start reducing and at what rate. And in addition to greenhouse gas emissions, there's also a bit of forestry and land use that we include as well. So with deforestation and afforestation, your groups will put in a percentage from 0 to 100, where 0 means that there's no change from the business as usual scenario, and 100% means they're putting in the maximum feasible action that they could take. So it's really a scale of how much action they're willing to take. And then finally, we have this issue of global climate finance, where each group, depending on if they're more on the developed side or developing side, they'll request or contribute a certain amount of money from the fund. And this is usually used as a way to have different groups negotiate for stronger targets. For example, some of the lower developing countries might advocate for funding in order to put forward stronger targets. Some of the developed countries who might be advocating for stronger climate action might offer up some different funding. So this last one is more used as a negotiating tool, and less so used as something that we can model specifically into our C-Roads model, and is a good way for the facilitator to really encourage different groups to negotiate with each other. So while your groups are kind of going over these proposal forms and their briefing statements, that's when you'll kind of take on this role of a UN official. So this is when the role play more officially begins. So you could play the UN Secretary General or the Executive Secretary of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. If you've got a blazer or a scarf or some way to demonstrate that you've taken on this new role. Sometimes if you are co-facilitating this with somebody else, they might introduce you when you walk into the room again. You might present yourself as this official as you speak for the first time, and just really take that role pretty seriously, because it also encourages your participants to do the same. So once you've kind of taken on that role, you'll present some opening remarks, which we have available for you in some slides, and you'll encourage your delegates to put forward strong targets and really speak with each other and propose actions to limit warming to below 2 degrees. So then you'll enter into the first round of negotiations. So in the first round, groups primarily just speak among themselves to kind of discuss what their opening proposals might be, their opening positions. They fill out the form based on what their briefing sheets are saying, discuss what their priorities are, and once they've kind of agreed on that, and once about 15-20 minutes have passed, or however much time you've allocated based on how much time you have for the whole simulation, you'll have one of the groups potentially negotiate with the other groups, which again might not happen that first time. And once they all feel comfortable with their proposals, they'll submit these pledges. So oftentimes there'll be one representative from each group that will come up to the front of the room, give a short presentation about what their country or negotiating bloc is proposing, and then they'll fill out this kind of proposal summary. This can be put up as a slide where they enter in their pledges. It could be put up on a whiteboard like you see here. Just put up somewhere as long as they're able to fill out what they've pledged. And so, for example, this is for a 6-region group version. So once you have had every group come up, present their pledges, and fill out this proposal summary, that's when you will input this actually into our model, which we've developed, which is called C-Roads. And that's really the unique part of this game and simulation, where you get to actually show your participants some of the real-time effects and impacts of their pledges. So C-Roads is available to download and also available online. So today I'm going to show you the downloaded version. So this is what it looks like when you open it up for the first time. You'll notice this table here on the bottom left looks exactly like that proposal summary form. As I mentioned, there's not that climate finance aspect of it here. That last part is mainly a negotiating tool between your teams. But the other tables are available here. So let's say we're looking at the 6-region version. This is where you'll input some of these proposals, and you'll put them all here, and you'll notice that these graphs will start to change, the temperature increase will start to change. So for example, if the United States group pledged that they want to peak emissions, let's say in 2050, you'll enter that in. You'll notice the red line here start to go down. You'll notice we have the temperature reduce slightly. If they want to reduce their emissions, you'll enter in what their reduction year is. This year has to be either the same or after their peak year. And when you enter in a reduction year, you also have to enter in a reduction rate. So let's say the United States wants to wait 10 years before they start reducing, and they start reducing in 2060. And you'll notice nothing moves yet because you have to put in the annual rate. Let's say 3%. So here you'll notice this red line start to go down, and you'll notice that there isn't too much impact on this temperature change because we still have all these other groups to also input in. And for deforestation and afforestation, let's say they for both want to put in kind of 50% effort. So you'll notice the other developing is quite a high line at the end of the century. So maybe the other developing want to start peaking their emissions 2050 as well. And you'll notice that goes down pretty significantly, as does the temperature. Again, they might start waiting another 25 years and start reducing at 2%. And you'll notice that difference as well. So you'll fill in this whole box and this whole table with your group's proposals. Almost always in the first round, we don't reach 2 degrees. You'll see here it takes quite a lot to get to that limit in warming. So just to take you around a little bit of some of the other features that you can show in C-Roads. So if you're playing the 3-region version, you can go to Simulation and switch to 3-region, and then it'll re-aggregate everything and put it into this 3-region version. If you want to just to demonstrate what a global input might look like, you have that option as well. You can also go here to graphs, and you'll notice right now the default graphs that we show are energy CO2 emissions and temperature increase. But if you're more interested in overall greenhouse gas emissions, you can do that. If you want to look at those by region, you can split that up as well. So you can really play around with some of these graphs depending on who your audience is. If your group is more interested perhaps in some of the economics or the finance aspects, they can look at the energy emissions per GDP once we start reducing emissions. There's also emissions per capita, just general information about gross world product and population. And then if you're also interested in some of the forestry issues, we have total emissions and removals, where you can look at the impact of afforestation, some of these land use emissions. So really play around with these graphs and pick some of the ones that you might want to choose based on who your audience is. On the right-hand side, we have what we call our impact graphs. So right now we're showing temperature increase, but if you were more interested in what sea level rise might look like by the end of the century, kind of playing around with the different impacts. We also have some of our model validation. If you are interested in how we came up with some of our numbers and what we compare against, you can look at some of those model validation graphs to see that these are kind of the scenarios that we compare against and learn a little bit more about how we calibrate and what assumptions we make. We can reset. And if you are interested in more the kind of technical back-end side of things and understanding a little bit deeper what some of our model assumptions are, you also have the ability to go here under simulation and assumptions and sensitivities. And you can look at some of the assumptions that we made in our business as usual scenario. And if there is something that you might want to explore differently, or if you don't agree with our climate sensitivity assumption, we allow you to change that based on your best knowledge and what you think it should be, just to give people the flexibility and trust that we want you all to explore the model in with whatever knowledge you see fit. And if you want to contest some of our assumptions or our business as usual, we let you do that a little bit here. So feel free to explore that as well. And as I mentioned, we have a lot of our materials in different languages, and the model itself we've also had translated in a few different languages as well. So if you are running the game in French, for example, you can also run the model in French. So there's a few different things to play around with here. So as you prepare to facilitate, I encourage you to look through and see what graphs you might want to show, what language you might want to present it in, what kind of obstacles or confusion you might come across, and be sure to email us about anything as you're preparing, and we'll be sure to answer any of your questions. So that's kind of a quick introduction into C-Roads. Again, you can download it or run it online. So once you do that and start kind of playing around with it, please feel free to email us with any questions you do have about the model. So after the first round of negotiations, you've inputted everything here. Maybe your group reached 3.5 degrees of temperature increase by 2100. So you'd go back, you would kind of check your results with your team, with your groups. Sometimes what we've seen facilitators do is you might demonstrate some sea level rise with a blue tarp. So often it's a little bit silly or funny and people laugh a little bit, but it becomes a kind of way to start talking more seriously about climate impacts and about the severity of some of these negotiations, and really encourage people to step up their pledges and propose things a little more strongly than they did in the first round. And so you'll kind of just go into as many rounds as you can based on how much time you have. Hopefully, you'll reach that 2-degree or 1.5-degree target. Some groups do and some groups don't, and that's okay, and that's what the debrief is for. So once you've decided and finished the number of negotiating rounds, usually 2 to 3, you'll kind of conclude the simulation and the official summit and negotiations, and you'll ask everybody to kind of step out of their roles and you'll enter into the debrief. So something that's good here is you ask people to kind of stretch, move around. You'll make sure that it's clear that you've stepped out of your role. A lot of times people do get quite into it by the end, quite into their roles, and so it's important to make sure you give people a little bit of time to step back out of it a little bit and just kind of get back to themselves. And then you'll lead them through this debrief, which we find is really the most important part and is where a lot of the learning happens. So a great kind of first question for everybody is to just ask how people are feeling. Sometimes there will be people who are really optimistic and engaged and energized by this experience, and others will feel a little bit frustrated and a little bit hopeless. So it helps to just ask people to share how they're doing and get a sense of the room and see if you have more participants who are more excited and hopeful, or if you have more people who might be a bit sad and frustrated, and kind of lead the debrief in a way that helps everybody understand some of what they're feeling and hopefully brings to light some of the more positive case studies and other insights and things. So after that, a good way to kind of shift from how people are feeling to more what is happening currently is bringing up and sharing some different kind of news stories or case studies about what's happening in the real world, what kind of climate action and action from delegates in reality we are seeing. Talk a bit about the Paris Agreement if you do have that knowledge, and just let people know what's actually happening in the real world. Another thing that's really useful is to offer more insights about things that maybe weren't able to be addressed during the simulation. So speak a little bit more clearly and intentionally about the urgency and the scale of action, and any equity considerations and climate justice issues that might not have been tackled too deeply within the simulation itself, and any other kind of things that you want to speak in more detail about that maybe you didn't get the chance to before. And then hope is a really big one, kind of gathering different examples of really strong climate action, or even some of the cost differences and declines in different energy supplies, talking about the different social movements that we've been seeing around the world, and just providing your participants with some case studies of the different levels and types of climate action that we've been seeing around the world, to kind of then bring them to the last point of offering them some ideas of how they might get involved past this simulation, how they might take action themselves, whether that be in social movements or at a political level or just on an individual level in terms of their own behaviors, and just giving them some ideas of how they might get more involved in the climate movement, and offering them some resources in order to do that. So we really hope that you'll take the time to dive into this debrief. It takes a little bit of time sometimes for people to get comfortable sharing some of their thoughts and feelings, but once the conversation gets going, we've really seen participants get quite vulnerable and open and really share some of their thoughts on the experience and also on the climate crisis in general, and how they might get involved. So we say dedicate as much time as you can to the debrief, given what your time constraints are. So that's a breakdown of how we tend to encourage facilitators to run their simulation. I will go over our website really quickly just to show you where you can find all of the materials to get ready for this. And once we go through the website, I will open up some questions. So if you've got them, be sure to write them into the questions box, and I will direct us over to our website here. So our website is climateinteractive.org. Where you're going to find most of your materials is under Programs, World Climate Simulation. And then you'll go over here to the right, Facilitator Resources and Materials. So you can watch this video. It's quite an old video now. It's about 12 minutes, kind of breaking down some of the things that we spoke about today. And as you keep going, you'll notice some of the key materials that you need. We've developed a facilitator guide, which is basically a written manual of a lot of things we spoke about today. It goes into more detail about certain things. So it's definitely the first thing that you want to kind of look at and read and see if you've got any questions. So you can download that here. We have the facilitator guide offered in a few different languages as well. And we have presentation slides also in many different languages. And so these are the slides that you would project to your participants. They go from an introduction to then officially opening up the ceremony, and they have a few climate science slides in there as well. And so it's a good slide deck to kind of look through and see which ones you'd want to present yourselves. And something I will say with a lot of this, we very intentionally make these free and open source, and we do our best to provide these materials, but we also encourage you to add more slides if you think your participants might need a little bit more on climate science, remove slides if you feel necessary. So please feel free to adapt the game however you see fit, whether that be in how you might want to present it to your group. If in your presentation slides you want to be showing different things, it's really up to you, and we encourage you to really adapt it to suit your audience best. So after you've taken a look at the facilitator guide and the slides, here you're going to download or load online C-Roads. So for this simulation specifically, we're using C-Roads World Climate. We have C-Roads Pro, which is a much more technical version in a pretty kind of slower format, which we don't really recommend to use for this type of game. It's more for those who are modeling things that might be a little more advanced, or if they want to see things disaggregated a little more. But the version that we looked at, the C-Roads World Climate, is here. So you can click here to download it, or you can also run it online based on if you're using a computer maybe that's not your own and you've got solid internet connection. You can run it just right online, C-Roads World Climate.climateinteractive.org. and it'll bring you to this page. You'll notice it looks pretty identical to the downloaded version. You have your menu here. So those are really the main things you as a facilitator will need, are these three things. Then you've got the materials that you're going to give to your participants. So here's where you'll find the briefing materials. So with the briefing materials, we have the 3 region briefings, we have the 6 region briefings, and we also have some of these additional groups that we've created. If you are interested in maybe having different voices other than just government delegates, we have some activist groups, some fossil fuel lobbyists, the media. In recent years, we created the U.S. Climate Alliance briefing group in order to bring in some non-governmental support for climate action from the United States. And so these, you don't necessarily have these groups, their main aim is to speak with the delegates, to convince them and encourage them to put forward different types of targets. We're not able to model what their specific proposals might be. Their roles are more so speaking with the delegates in order for them to put forward different types of pledges. So if you're interested in adding some of those different groups, you can feel free to do that. Sometimes if you are in a classroom setting, we've seen teaching assistants take on some of these roles, whereas most of the students or the groups will be divided among their regions. So we have these briefing statements also available in several different languages. Then we've got the proposal form that you all saw, which you will pass out to every group. And then just these kind of table labels where each group will have kind of a label so that everybody knows who's who and who's sitting where. So up here are the main materials that you'll need. As you scroll down this page, you'll see some more materials. We have videos. A lot of people like to see examples of what a world climate simulation looks like. So we have these videos of other people running them, some more explainer videos, some photos. We also have a Facebook group if you'd like to join. Many of these links will be sent in the email that should be coming to you about an hour after we finish the webinar. So you'll be able to follow that link if you'd like to join our Facebook group for facilitators, where you can ask questions to other facilitators, and you can also share your photos and things. And here we have additional materials. So if you're thinking about running World Climate for smaller, younger children, there are some tips on how to maybe adapt it to those groups. If you're running it with a really large group, how you might adapt it that way. Some vocabulary, some data tables. If you'd like to market your simulation, we have some flyers here. So take a look at these additional materials to see if anything is useful for you. And then, as always, we're always available to answer your questions as you're going through these, and make sure you're as well prepared as you can be for your simulation. And once you're preparing and maybe have a sense of when exactly your simulation is going to be, we really ask that you register your event. So that's how we get all those pins on that map, is from people registering their event. So you can do this before your event, and you can also do it after your event. So it just asks some basic information about how many people were there, how many people you plan to be there, where you held it, who was your audience, any comments that you have for us. So we really ask that you register your event so that we have a better sense of who's running it around the world, and we can really get some more accurate metrics of how people have run it and when and where. So that's most of what I have for you today. I will put my email available right here. Bindu Bandari also works on some of our world climate things as well. So you can feel free to email either of us any questions that you have about world climate. If you are working through things and you're reading something and you have maybe some questions and you're a little confused, feel free to email us, and we'll be sure to get back to you and make sure that you have a better understanding of anything you might need. Really looking forward to hearing about some of the different events that you'll be holding and hearing how they go for you, and here to support you all as you go through the process of preparing. So thank you all so much for joining. Look out for that email from us, and hope to speak to you all soon with any questions or concerns that you have. All right. Have a great day, everybody.